So it's now been about 3 weeks since the launch of the most recent Diablo 4 expansion, Lord of Hatred. And while this expansion is by far the best version of Diablo 4, it has been an incredibly fun expansion and just given players so much more to do, so much more to go grind, and pretty much everything has just been more enjoyable. But you probably haven't realized how close we are to the next season. So season 14, because not only was season 12 a much shorter season than usual, basically being half a season, the season we're currently in, season 13, is actually going to be a lot shorter than normal as well. So in this video, I want to go over when the next season is going to be, but I also want to go over some of the things I really want to see in season 14. And just to start off, we do already know when the next season is going to launch unless there's some delay, which I doubt there will be, because this expansion released on April 27th, and the next season should be starting on June 30th, which is a Tuesday. Because if you go log into the game and you go check the reliquary, or what used to be the battle pass, there is a date timer on those because they have to give you an accurate date, because that's when you can no longer earn things in the battle pass that you paid for. And if you go check that right now, which I'm recording this on May 20th, it will say there are 41 days left, which will take us to June 30th, which again is on a Tuesday, which is when seasons usually launch. And that will mean season 13 will be a 64-day season. Usually we get a new season every 3 months, which is kind of crazy because season 12 was basically half a season. Then we're going into a 64-day season. So these last handful of seasons have been much faster than previous seasons, which is pretty crazy. Now, I don't necessarily think that this means that season 14 is going to be smaller than a normal 3-month season, because if we go back and look at season 12 was a bit smaller than normal seasons. It was obviously half a season, so that would make sense. Then we go into the expansion, and the expansion really didn't have a season. It's pretty much just the expansion. We got an extended season journey, which didn't really add anything new, and while that was absolutely the correct decision, there was so much new with the expansion that adding more seasonal stuff on top of that didn't make sense. I think they did the perfect option of adding more season journey, extending that out and giving more rewards through it, but just focusing on the new expansion stuff. But I do also think that means going into season 14, it's a pretty good chance we'll have a normal size season, because you go from a smaller season to basically no season specific content to going into a new season. And even though there was much less time getting to that, they should have had enough time to give us at least close to a normal season amount of content, whatever a normal season amount of content will be, because now, since so many systems have been remade and are in a much better spot, we will probably start to see seasons with a lot more content than we were previously getting, even though seasons before season 12 did add quite a lot of new stuff. So season 14 will be on June 30th unless there is a delay. Now that brings me to what I want to see with season 14. Now this is kind of hard because first off, we don't know what sizes of seasons we'll be getting going into future seasons. Presumably they're going to get back to having 3-month seasons, which is normally what we would have and what we usually should have. And presumably those are going to be a bit more content than we were getting previously, because again, for the past year plus, they have been remaking a majority of the game. Every new season came with a big rework to an existing system, and now the majority of Diablo 4 is in a very good space. And I'm not talking about like balance changes or making warplanes account wide or stuff like that. I'm talking about the big system overhauls or how systems actually work. Much more of the game is in a much better spot, meaning they could focus much more on new content, which is I think going to be the best thing for the game now, because now going into a new season, they can just focus on, first off, balancing classes, which has always been a thing, but having a little bit more work being able to be put into that will be good. But then pretty much everything else is just going to be focused on new content, which I think is really good. But because, as mentioned, we're going from fast season to fast season into this next season after the expansion, we don't know how much content is generally going to be in it. We don't know the structure of seasons going forward. We don't know if they're going to be focusing on like giving us seasonal powers and giving us a bunch of season specific stuff, or if they're going to be focusing on just adding a bunch of new content with every new season that is like permanent stuff that is built to be permanent. We don't know their philosophy going forward on seasons, so it's kind of hard to know what exactly to expect, but there is some stuff that I think will be somewhat easily implemented that I very much want to see. Now, the first thing isn't really new stuff, but it's the reintroduction of old stuff. And by this, I specifically mean temperings and legendary aspects. Because going into Lord of Hatred, we knew that they were taking most of the gameplay changing stuff out of legendary aspects, putting it into the skill tree. If you go and remember or go look at old lists of legendary aspects, the amount of gameplay changing stuff that is how builds were generally created back then that were removed from legendary aspects and just not added back into the game is pretty crazy. Or at least for Druid, which is the main I play, I can off the top of my head think of like a dozen legendary aspects that were not added back into the game through the new skill tree or through any other system that were super fun, super integral to build, that were removed from the game and they're just not existent anymore. There's a ton of them. A bunch of builds that we had previously that were fun builds also just don't exist because the things that were from legendary aspects just don't exist anymore. So a good example is Tramp Slide for the Druid, which was one of the most fun builds in previous seasons of the game, more specifically like some of the first seasons, but legitimately pretty much the entirety of that build no longer exists because all of the things that created that build were legendary aspects and they just don't exist anymore. There's so much stuff through legendary aspects that were removed that were build defining, which I think should be added back in, and whether they add it back through legendary aspects or through new uniques doesn't really matter to me. I think either are going to be fine. It would also work if they just added like more variance to skills, except I have a suspicion that they're probably not going to be expanding the skill trees very much, if at all, until the next expansion. Having these new powers will probably have to come through pieces of gear, so I hope they add those back, or at least a chunk of those back in some way. I think they could add more gameplay impacting stuff through legendary aspects. I think legendary aspects weren't really that big of an issue previously when a lot of them were gameplay impacting, because now legendary aspects are honestly too simple. Pretty much all of them are just like a multiplicative damage increase that you just compare to another multiplicative damage increase and see which one is slightly better or slightly worse for the build you're currently running. That's basically like every legendary aspect now. So I hope we get more gameplay impacting stuff added back into that system. They don't need to just be very simple power increases. We can have some gameplay impacting stuff in there. And likewise, temperings. I don't know what the devs are going to be doing with the tempering system now, because they basically removed absolutely anything interesting from the tempering system. The tempering system is legitimately very, very basic affixes now. Not even the most interesting affixes either, because pretty much every build in the game is running crit chance on weapons. If you could do resolve, you do resolve on any slot you can get it on, and then you're just doing like additive damage increases for other slots. Like so basic. And if you remember what temperings had in the past, temperings used to have what is essentially multicasting. Temperings used to have radius or size increases for skills. Temperings used to have the chance for a skill to deal double damage, which that one doesn't necessarily need to come back because it's just a balancing nightmare. But stuff like double casting or radius increases or tons of other stuff that we no longer have. Tempering was significantly better than it is right now. Tempering right now basically doesn't need to exist anymore. It's essentially just more boring and less impactful versions of base stats you get on gear. Like the only thing you would basically miss from tempering right now is to more easily get your crit cap, losing all the extra resolve you could get on gear, which you could just add somewhere else. So I don't know what they're doing with tempering. They really need to add a bunch of stuff back. Tempering was originally supposed to be a system to add in really impactful and much more interesting affixes that you can't normally get on gear. They completely removed every aspect of the tempering system being interesting. So they either need to reintroduce a ton of interesting stuff into the tempering system or basically just remove it. As of right now, tempering has basically no reason to exist. Just remove tempering and add more power into a few aspects on gear and you basically have the same thing. And I hope they don't remove tempering. I hope they add back interesting stuff into tempering, because it used to be a really good and interesting system. Now it's basically just like a small affix increase, which at this point, because tempering is so boring, it's actually a net negative to the game because you have to to sit there and re-spam your tempers to get GAs on a super boring affix. Hopefully they re-add stuff into that system and it's not just going to stay like this. And then there's some other stuff that I just chalk up to like general game balancing or quality of life stuff, like war plans being account wide. I do think they should probably make war plans longer to progress if they do account wide. I think that would be the best thing. They make war plans longer to progress through, but just the entirety of your account all goes towards that. So if you play on one character and you go get 100 activity experience for that skill tree, it's just account wide. So you could go earn 100 on this character, 100 on this character, and it's the same thing. So you could play as many alts as you want and they're all progressing towards the same thing, which means they could just slow it down a bit, but the entirety of your account gets that progress. Hopefully they would also allow you to have different trees depending on what character you're playing on. So if I go playing my druid, hopefully I could set up a different tree than on my other class without having to like respec what I just did on my druid. So that's a big change. We already know that for season 14 they're going to have a change to allow people playing in a group to line up their war plans, so that will already be in there. We just need them account wide. That'll be a pretty nice addition to the game. Then you obviously just have like general balancing of classes and everything that we get every season. I would expect to see a nerf to the Glynn's Anvil legendary aspect that just like 10x people's toughness right now, which is pretty crazy. I suspect we'll hopefully see some pretty big druid changes. If you play druid right now, hopefully Might of the Urzine is nerfed into the ground and they buff up a ton of other stuff, so every build doesn't have to be Might of Urzine. And I'm sure for a lot of the other classes there are things like this as well, so general overall balancing and stuff like that. And then other balancing, like hopefully it's easier to obtain the higher tier gems without needing to just farm the one dungeon, Seer's Rest. Hopefully they massively buff up, say, the gem fragments you can get out of Gem Reserve and Nightmare Dungeons. Hopefully they massively buff up the gems you get from Infernal Horde runs. In fact, if they just like 25x'd the gem fragments from Infernal Horde runs, it would actually probably be worthwhile to go farm that instead of farming like Seer's Rest or something. But it legitimately would need like that big of an increase to be worthwhile. But then looking past just like general balance and quality of life stuff, the new stuff I want to see, as much new content as it could pop out. As much new endgame content, new endgame systems, new nodes in the warplane trees, new crafting for the Haradra Cube, new legendary aspects, new uniques. I think the game is in such a good spot right now that I think just more of everything will pretty much be a winning season. And on top of that, because we have so many of these systems now that are very good at a baseline, they can just add new seasonal stuff much more easily. They could just add some crazy new craft in the Haradra Cube, like how we got Sanctification that turned into Transfigure. They could just add a new crazy craft for that season into the cube. They could just add crazy new systems into the existing endgame skill trees that we can put points into to unlock these new crazy seasonal mechanics. So just more of basically everything. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.